Greetings. Father Mark signing on with a historical presentation on the background of the devotion to Our Lady of Prompt Succor, better known outside of New Orleans as Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And we will explore the connection between those two devotions, as well as how they developed in a distinct manner from each other. And so, by way of introduction, 2 centuries ago, on January 8th, 1815, a battle occurred downriver from New Orleans in Chalmette, Louisiana. The battle was waged between the 39-year-old Republic of the United States against the centuries-old Empire of Great Britain. This Battle of New Orleans, as it came to be called, was the last time that the two nations fought each other, as it came at the end of the last war declared between the two. A war, the War of 1812, which witnessed the burning of our capital city, Washington, D.C. Those involved in the Battle of New Orleans attributed its outcome in large measure to prayer invoking the protection of the Blessed Mother, and the gratitude is still observed annually into the 21st century. The totality of this event is far beyond the scope of a single presentation. So, in this session, we will confine ourselves to reflecting on only 3 points. First, the place of this event in the history of our nation. Second, this event as an exemplar of devotion to Our Lady in general. And third, as a moment when devotion to Our Lady of Prompt Succor, in particular, entered into ordinary Catholic usage in our region. So beginning with the history of our nation, the event was part of the War of 1812, which fit within the 26-year period of warfare triggered by the French Revolution and the conquest of Napoleon and the coalition wars against Napoleon. Both conflicts ended in 1815. The War of 1812 ended in January, and Napoleon's final defeat occurred at Waterloo on June 18th, the same year. The fourth President of the United States was James Madison, born in Port Conway, Virginia, graduated from the College of New Jersey. That was its name in the colonial period. Today this is Princeton University. And he served as president when the two conflicts came to an end. James Madison drafted the Constitution of the United States. He joined Alexander Hamilton and John Jay in composing the 85 essays promoting ratification of the Constitution that are subsequently referred to as the Federalist Papers. They were written under the collective pseudonym of Publius. Hamilton wrote 50 of the essays, John Jay wrote 5, James Madison wrote 30. Madison served as Secretary of State during Thomas Jefferson's 2 terms as president, in which capacity he supervised the negotiations that led to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. He followed Jefferson as the 4th president with a vision of a much stronger federal government than that of Jefferson's. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British government adopted a naval policy called Orders of Council. This asserted the British right to regulate the commerce of all nations with the parts of continental Europe controlled by their enemy, Napoleon. These orders of council were enforced by the routine boarding of merchant ships, regardless of which flag they flew, to search for trade goods regarded by England as contraband. Any refusal by the merchant to be boarded was regarded as a declaration of hostilities against Britain. The ship would be subject to attack. In the course of these boardings, the British felt free to engage in a practice called impressment. That is a euphemism, a Royal Navy term for kidnapping the sailors of a boarded ship and forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. Taking this in context, the United States had recently overcome similar actions of piracy against a collection of criminal mariners called the Barbary Corsairs. These pirates were given safe harbor in various cities of North Africa, the southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, specifically Algiers, Morocco, Tunis, and Tripoli. That's Tripoli in present-day Libya, not Tripoli. Anyway, it's the one in present-day Libya. And they were given safe harbor in exchange for a percentage of the profits of the piracy. They used a number of excuses, which I won't get into. President Jefferson at the time was personally loath to engage in a foreign war, but he saw no solution to the piracy other than direct military action. The small American Navy and Marine Corps of the period enjoyed the services of a Maryland Catholic named Captain Stephen Decatur. The Barbary War consisted of Captain Decatur as well as other American officers sailing into the harbors of the Barbary coast, sinking all of the ships in that coast, and then landing the Marines to march on the palace of the local ruler and to advise him against providing safe harbor for the Barbary Corsairs in the future. Hence the line in the Marine Corps anthem, the Shores of Tripoli line, that refers to the Tripoli in Libya, where they engaged in this form of diplomacy. The success of this enterprise convinced Madison that the American military was up to the challenge of British impressment. Such action certainly entitled the United States to engage in self-defense. But the American Navy at that period was too small to consider engagement against the British Isles themselves, so President Madison's solution was to attack the nearest British colony, at the time, Canada. The plan was to launch a three-pronged invasion of Canada in 1812. It ended in disaster, for the same reasons that Napoleon's invasion of Russia, coincidentally in the same year, failed. The distances involved made the supply chains too long and vulnerable, and the Canadian winter was hostile to large-scale troop movements. Of the three contingents, the first was forced to surrender at Detroit. The second was defeated at the Niagara River frontier, and the third made it to the St. Lawrence River, but was then forced to retreat. The next year, 1813, the United States tried it again, another three-pronged attack against Canada. This time, one contingent achieved victory when Commodore Oliver Perry won the Battle of Lake Erie. This was followed by the burning of Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. The reason being that that was the capital of Upper Canada at the time. The second prong of the invasion also achieved victory when General William Henry Harrison, later the 9th President of the United States, defeated an Anglo-Indian alliance south of Lake Huron. It's called the Battle of the Thames. The third contingent suffered a defeat at Plattsburgh on the New York-Vermont border. That allowed the British to invade and occupy Maine. Well, Maine wasn't a state yet. At the time, it was part of Massachusetts, but later in 1820, it became the state of Maine. The next year, in terms of the war, 1814, the British hit back hard by invading Maryland and burning the capital, our capital, Washington, D.C., in retaliation for our burning of Toronto. American Marines then inflicted a stinging defeat on the British at Bladensburg, Maryland, which caused the British to withdraw. Meanwhile, the British had dispatched another contingent to sail up the Mississippi River to gain control of its delta by capturing the city of New Orleans. The British defeat in Maryland, coupled with the rising cost of the war for the Americans, created an environment conducive to negotiations for peace. This culminated in the Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. Yet the British southern contingent, intended to capture the mouth of the river, was still sailing for New Orleans. They had no way to communicate with the home islands. So they were sailing for New Orleans under the command of a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, General Sir Edward Packenham. In the first week of January 1815, fishing boats spotted dozens of British ships entering Lake Bourne from the Gulf of Mexico. Word was sent to New Orleans, where it found Andrew Jackson, who would later become the 7th U.S. president. At this point, he was not yet. Jackson was born in South Carolina, but made his political career in Tennessee. During the War of 1812, he was serving as Major General of the Tennessee Militia, which had gone down the Mississippi to reinforce New Orleans against the possibility of exactly what the British were attempting. The British plan was to sail into Lake Bourne, land troops on the southern coast, then march overland to the Mississippi River, where they would turn west to attack New Orleans by land, thereby avoiding the cannons of the forts farther down the river. Looking at the map, the plan seemed perfectly reasonable, as there is only a narrow rectangle of land separating the southern coast of Lake Bourne from the Mississippi River where it turns. However, actually walking on that land presents a very different scenario. Owing to a combination of the swampland and the mud, which is the topography of that rectangle, the pace of the British advance was slow. Along with this, coupled with the British desire to assemble all of their forces together for a decisive attack against the city. This allowed Jackson and the Americans time to prepare. In the defense, Jackson had 3 key advantages. First, he decided to strip the big naval guns from the American ships in the river and use them on land instead. Second, he had the men dig an earthen wall along the Rodriguez Canal on the plantation of Chalmette de Marigny, which would enable his men and the cannon to fire at the British while they were protected. Third, he ordered his men to fill the cannon with grape shot instead of with a standard metal ball. Grape shot was a type of ordnance pioneered in the 18th century. It consisted of small metal balls, like today, like ball bearings, packed on top of a gunpowder charge. So essentially, this turned the cannons into giant shotguns. This was, instead of just firing one single ball at the enemy, it would be hundreds of them at a high velocity propelled by gunpowder. The British, approaching these defenses, had 15,000 troops. The Americans had 6,000. It looked like the Americans and the city of New Orleans were doomed. They had no reason to expect any better treatment than our capital had, which the British incinerated earlier in the war. So on the night of January 7th, the Ursuline sisters went before the Blessed Sacrament and stayed there throughout the night. Others joined them in the chapel, praying and weeping, frankly, before the statue of Our Lady. New Orleans had no resident bishop at the time. It's a complicated, actually, that I might do a separate video on that, but the short version is that our first bishop was the Most Reverend Luis Penalvar y Cardenas. He had been transferred to Guatemala, and his replacement had not yet been appointed, because the Pope was a prisoner of the armies of the French Revolution and did not have freedom of communication. So he would not be freed until Napoleon was defeated. So there was no bishop in the city, but there certainly were priests. On the morning of January 8th, the priest who was serving as the vicar general of the diocese was Father William de Bourg. But later he would end up being bishop in New Orleans, but not yet. At this point he was still a priest. He joined the nuns. He offered Mass in the chapel. On the top of the reredos, above the altar, was a statue of Our Lady, which had been installed 5 years earlier. Artillery fire from the battle could be heard during the Mass. The prioress of the Ursuline convent, Mother Sainte Marie Olivier de Vezine, made a vow to have a Mass of thanksgiving offered every year if the American forces prevailed and saved the city. Before that Mass ended, news arrived that the British had indeed been defeated. The British suffered 2,042 casualties. 291 of those were killed, including the commander, the General Packenham. The Americans suffered 71 casualties, 13 dead, 39 wounded. Neither side knew that the peace treaty had already been signed, but despite what is often said, the war was not technically over, because the treaty had not yet been ratified by the Senate. That took place the following month, on February 17th, 1815. General Andrew Jackson himself, although not a Catholic, nevertheless, he went to the convent to thank the nuns for their prayers, saying, quote, "By the blessing of heaven, directing the valor of the troops under my command, one of the most brilliant victories in the annals of war was obtained." Later he proclaimed to his troops, describing the victory in a letter as a signal interposition of heaven. This declaration turns our attention to the second point of importance regarding the Battle of New Orleans, that is, the intercessory role of Our Lady. The teaching of the Church on the role of Our Lady is summarized in the Catechism, numbers 963 to 975, which deal with Mary as Mother of Christ and Mother of the Church. Within that section, Mary's role specifically as Mediatrix of Grace is explained in numbers 969 and 970. A quote from 969. This motherhood of Mary in the order of grace continues uninterruptedly from the consent which she loyally gave at the Annunciation. Taken up to heaven, she did not lay aside this saving office, but by her manifold intercession continues to bring us the gifts of eternal salvation. Therefore, the Blessed Virgin is invoked in the Church under the titles of Advocate, Helper, Benefactress, and Mediatrix. End quote. Biblical foundation for these teachings is to be found in the Gospels of Matthew, chapters 1 and 2, along with the Gospel of Luke, chapters 1 and 2, which establish that Mary is the mother of Jesus. Turning to the Gospel of John, chapter 19, we find Jesus on the cross entrusting his mother to the Apostle John, son of Zebedee, and naming his own mother also the mother of that disciple. That's in John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. The book of Revelation, chapters 12 through 14, configure the role of Our Lady in both the natural and supernatural orders, as eternally opposed to Satan and all those who follow evil. Part of our Catholic spiritual tradition is the use of sacred art to focus our thoughts and prayers, to call upon Our Lady for her intercession. The Catechism explains the proper use of this practice in numbers 1150 through 1162, which cites the Second Council of Nicaea, which is the Seventh Ecumenical Council, that took place in the year 787. Further, it cites, the Catechism cites, the first treatise on sacred images, composed by the Eastern Doctor of the Church, St. John Damascene, Book 1, chapters 16 and 27. So this is just a representative quote from the Catechism number 1161. All these signs in the liturgical celebrations are related to Christ, as are sacred images of the Holy Mother of God and of the saints as well. They truly signify Christ, who is glorified in them. They make manifest the cloud of witnesses, who continues to participate in the salvation of the world. And referencing the cloud of witnesses, that's referencing the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 12, verse 1. Images of Our Lady are too numerous to count, but it is possible to trace the continuity of some of the particular representations of Our Lady, specifically the one that's relevant to the Battle of New Orleans. For that, we turn to the third section of today's presentation, and that brings us to the Holy Land during the Roman Empire. After the crucifixion of Christ, a life-size icon was created on a rectangular-shaped board, sheathed in gold. On one side was etched an image of the crucified Christ, meaning referring to the end of the earthly life of Jesus. On the other side was etched a full-length image of Our Lady holding the infant Jesus, referring to the beginning of his earthly life. So on one side, the beginning, on the other side, the end. The image of Our Lady is pictured holding the baby in her left arm, the baby Jesus, while pointing toward him with her right hand. This gesture gave this image its name. In Greek, the Hodegetria. It literally means she who shows the way. In the Western Church, this type of icon is sometimes called Our Lady of the Way, if it's just a general image of Our Lady pointing to Jesus. But some, as the ones we'll cover, have more specific names because of other attributes of the image. So the Hodegetria, I'll put the spelling in the description section below. During the reign of the Emperor Theodosius II,